Hi, and welcome to the Running Records presentation for the week of the 5th of November. We will be working with Running Records and how these assessments inform a guided reading lesson, which we are calling a mini lesson. So hopefully this will be some good initial information to what is a running record and give you some background and how we're going to be using running records in the class. Marie Clay is the guru of running records. She is no longer with us, but has written many books and taught many classes on reading and specifically assessing students using running records. And some things she says that's quite interesting, especially in this day and age of high stakes testing. Yet a funny thing happens on the way to those final assessments. Day-to-day learning takes place. I'm certain that in education, evaluation needs to pay more attention to the systematic observation of learners who are on their way to those final assessments. I take that to mean that the assessments aren't really what matters. It's the day-to-day instruction and our observations and the assessments that we make when we are one-on-one or small group with our students that really helps them get to those final assessments. A little more about Marie Clay. She did conduct studies using running records starting back in the 1960s. This is a way for teachers to assess their students very quickly. And in a running record assessment, the text is only about 100 words long, 150 at most. We're trying to do something very quickly when we're using a running record, as seen in the previous point. So the text that you'll be working with is going to be a fairly short one. Running records are a snapshot of a student's reading behaviors. This is done by giving a student something to read, and the teacher then documents using a specific type of code or shorthand to detail information of what behaviors the student is exhibiting while reading. The codes are very consistent. They don't differ depending on the teacher or what text is being read or what level the student is. The codes that we use to code a running record are universal. Every teacher learns these same codes and every teacher uses essentially these same codes when they use these assessments. Running records also provide a teacher with playback of an entire oral reading episode, including the smallest details of the reader's attitude, demeanor, accuracy, and understanding. In a really quick 100 words or less, sit down with one student reading, that student reading and you assessing their reading, you get so much information out of that little bit of time and effort from the student. This is what a running record that is coded looks like. The text is here in the center of the page. The student reads this: "The wheel comes off the truck." That's what we're hoping that they read. And the check marks that you see are where the student has read the word correctly. But let's say here, off, there's a code above the word off. This is where I recognize the student said of instead of off. And then he turned around and self-corrected himself. So he said of, but recognized he did that wrong and then said off after that. This code here tells me that the student made an error, but then corrected himself. And we'll go through these very explicitly later in class on Monday and practice and practice and practice and practice. Over here is where the analysis comes from and all of the data comes from. And we're going to look very much into what that, how we do that and what that looks like when we do an assessment like this with a student. Why do we use running records? Well, they are an assessment tool. We need to know where our student's reading level is, and this is one of the best ways to do that. It does help us document our students' progress. You start usually with the lowest letter, such as level A, and then move up throughout the year. You might do 4 running records with your students throughout the year, one every 9 weeks or so. And this way you can document if the student is progressing in their reading skills or not. It definitely gives you some insight into what the student does when they're reading, if they're using strategies that they've been taught or that you have been teaching them. It helps you recognize patterns in students' reading and in their learning and helps you plan for future instruction. Say you recognize some particular patterns in multiple students, maybe that's a time when you plan a guided reading lesson for those students to improve their learning. It's one of the best ways to find the appropriate reading level for students and, of course, to help in your guided reading instruction. What does the teacher do during a running record assessment? You're there, the teacher is there to observe the child's reading behaviors while tracking the student's accuracy and errors on your own sheet of paper. The child's role is to read the text independently, where the teacher is not helping them, very similarly to our previous assessments, the early literacy assessment and the word study or spelling inventory. But the child is expected to read, and the teacher is expected to track and document what behaviors the student's exhibiting while they're reading. When you're conducting a running record, you're going to choose a book or a passage, hopefully something that's somewhat familiar to a student, but that's not always possible, so we're not going to worry too much about whether a child has read it before. The teachers at Bowie do have a particular program that they use to complete running records. So most of your teachers will have examples for you to borrow from, and feel free to ask them. They will certainly help you to find a text and or some book that you could use with your case study student. So you choose something for the student to read. Then you sit next to the student so that you both have your eyes on the text. You will want a copy of the text. So if you have paper copy, make yourself a paper copy, because you're going to need to check mark and do the coding for the student as the student reads. When the student's reading, if indeed they make an error in their reading, you're going to draw a line just above the text on the page where the student made the error. As you see in number 1 right here, the child's behavior goes above the line. So the words they say are under the line. The words in the text are under the line, and the words they say incorrectly goes above the line. And then you follow the other specific coding guidelines, which again are universal, and we will go over them explicitly in class. At the end of the oral reading, the teacher may ask the child to retell the story. This is simply to improve comprehension skills, to see if the student is understanding what they're reading, because remember, the whole goal of teaching reading is to teach comprehension. Again, here's some symbols that are used to code a running record. The recording method is, if you remember in that previous slide, the student makes an error and the text is listed underneath the line, the text that the student should have read, and then what the student said goes above the line. You use check marks for all of the words that are accurately read. The student may make a substitution error, a self-correction, a repetition error, a repetition of phrase error, or even an omission. And there are a couple of other errors that we're going to focus on as well. This one's just to give you an idea of what these look like as you're coding your running record. Once your student has completed reading the text and you've coded as the student is reading, then you want to do your data scoring. This is quantitative data, which gives you numbers that explicitly tells you where your student's reading level is. We first find the accuracy rate. And by the accuracy rate, this tells us what level of reader our student currently is. So you've got all these numbers. You subtract the number of errors from the total number of words in the text, and then divide by total words and multiply by 100. That gives you a percentage. In the example, we have a percentage ending in 92%. And if you notice here at the bottom of the screen, 92% lands right in the instructional level. That's where we want our students to be. If the student lands at the frustration level, the text was too difficult for that student and it's not an accurate reading of where their instructional level is. So if you're doing a running record and your accuracy rate comes up at the frustrational level, I ask that you look at a text that's on a lower level than what you've already tried and see if you can get your student to the instructional level. Conversely to that, if the student lands in the independent level range, that text was too simple for the student and you want to find something that may be a level higher than what the student previously read to check for what could be their instructional level. We also look at how many times the student corrected themselves. This is a ratio, so how many self-corrects out of how many words. So there's a number of errors plus the number of self-corrections divided by the number of self-corrections equals the self-correction ratio. I don't like all the numbers, so you guys are going to have to figure this out when we do these together. And then there's the error ratio. How many times did a student make an error based on how many words they read? Total words divided by total errors equals the error ratio. We are going to be doing this in class, so consider your math skills as you're working through this. Once we've gotten our analysis and we know our numbers, we have to look at the quality of the errors that the students are making. What's the qualitative analysis? Why is the student making this error? And we do that by looking at the 3 cueing systems. We talked about this previously in the reading processes seminar. We did the activity where you decoded a comprehension code based on the 3 Little Pigs. And during that seminar, we talked about how we use particular cueing systems when we're reading that helps us read. Those 3 cueing systems are meaning and what the words in the sentences mean, the structure of the sentence, which is the grammatical structure, are the words in grammatical order, and visual. That's how words or letters look to the reader. So we call that the MSV. And you might have noticed on the example of the running record that was in a previous slide, there is 2 columns of MSV analysis that we will identify. We're going to be looking at whether the student, when they made a mistake in reading, were they using their meaning cue, were they using their structure cue, or were they using their visual cue? Once we identify if the student makes a pattern of more meaning cues or more structure cues or more visual cues, then we know where we need to begin instruction for this student to improve their reading level. Do we need to improve their vocabulary and their word meanings? Do we need to improve their knowledge of grammar and how to build a sentence? Or do we need to help them with their visual cues? Are they confusing letters and words? Are they skipping over things and going too fast? Those are all part of the visual cue. Just a quick chart to further explain the meaning, structure, and visual cues. The quick cheat sheet I like specifically because of the questions that we can ask when we're looking for why the student made the mistake they made. So if we're looking at meaning, the question we need to ask is, with the way the student read the mistake, does that still make sense in the sentence? If it does, great, move on. If it doesn't, then they've got an error in meaning. Does the sentence sound right the way the student said it? If they made a mistake in reading, but it still sounds right, then maybe they're using their structure cue. And then visual, does the mistake and the word they said mistakenly look like the word in the text? If it does, they may just be confusing letters. If it doesn't, the student may not have knowledge of that word and may need to be instructed. Just more information on the cueing systems. This would be helpful when you are going to be creating your lesson plans that follow the running record assessment and analysis. Specifically, if we're looking at the meaning cue You want to work on things like prior knowledge and story sense, illustrations and vocabulary. If we're working on the structure cue, the student needs to learn more grammatical patterns and language structures. And the visual cue could be any number of things, but if we're talking print conventions specifically, and a student hasn't yet learned to read from left to right, or that there's space between words, then maybe we need to teach them that. Here are some additional resources that you might want to look into for more information about running records. Specifically, Reading A to Z. It is a site where you do have to sign up to use the materials, some of the materials, but they do offer some free documents for you to print. Reading A to Z offers leveled text for teachers to use when assessing a student in a running record assessment. So if your teacher at Bowie does not have anything to offer you as a text, and Mr. Dameron in the library is not able to help, then Reading A to Z is another source that you could use for this particular assignment. That's a quick recap of what is running records, and I want to show you very quickly that there are a few steps to conducting or giving a running record. Again, remember you select the text. Remember that's a text that's 100 to 150 words, hopefully no more than 100 words. That would be maybe something that's familiar to the student, and possibly, hopefully, something that is already at instructional level where the student could still use some instruction. Then you introduce the text, tell the student what you're going to be doing and what the text might be about, give them a little recap of it. And then you take the running record. While you're seated next to the child, you've got a copy of the text. While the child's reading on that copy of the text, you are making your code marks on the text so that you are identifying where the student gets words read correctly and is making mistakes when reading. Once you've gotten all of your codes down, the student has completed reading, you can further ask the student questions about retelling the story and some further comprehension questions. And then you would move into your data analysis with the accuracy rate, error rate, self-correct ratio, and etc. We are going to practice this a couple of times in class. Hopefully this will all be helpful to you so that when we get to class on Monday, you will be ready to go and ready to practice. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend.